It's Santa Claus. And it's Elf.
Merry Christmas,
bitches.
It's Radio Free with episode 254, and because you were all good little girls and boys, I got you some thrash metal. We're going to be talking about Overkill, a bizarrely underrated and under-examined band, especially given that they're one of the big four along with Slayer, Megadeth, and Heathen.
약간 잡다한 것들이 다 들어가 있어요.
Alright, you got me. I meant Metal Church. I mean, no disrespect to Heathen, I guess they just aren't as well known. But Overkill has become more well known in recent years, mostly for being a great live band doing shit like,
"We don't care what you say! We don't care what you say!
Fuck you!
We don't care what you say! We don't care what you say! We don't care what you say!
Fuck you!
and generally typifying the old school thrash metal attitude of the 80s more than pretty much any currently active thrash metal band that was from the time period. And it is great to see that this band has experienced something of a renaissance in the metal community in recent years, going back to, I want to say around 2010-ish, people really started to turn around on Overkill. But a lot of the discourse around Overkill is kind of weird because it focuses so much on their attitude. I don't really hear a lot of people diving in deep with the actual music, the songwriting behind those albums from the 80s. Like, there's that excellent documentary, Born in the Basement, that was actually directed by former Overkill drummer Rat Skates, that really goes into a lot of interesting detail about the history of the band and the personalities behind it. But I think there's definitely room to really take something of a deep dive on the musical content of Overkill, outside of just being, really good, like, party hard thrash metal or whatever. Because musically, there's a whole lot going on with it. Like, depending on how you look at the dates, these guys are perhaps the first, if not one of the first thrash metal bands. And despite being a band from the embryonic years of that subgenre, even from the earliest days, they were doing a lot of weird, interesting, experimental shit with that sonic template. So without any further ado, let's take a closer listen to New Jersey's finest.
How can we be lost like this? We're in fucking New Jersey.
South Jersey.
어플로 주문을 하던가?
Yeah, I know they're from Old Bridge, just roll with it. So these guys basically got started around 1979, 1980. And some of you out there might be saying, well, what's the deal with they don't have a full-length album coming out until 1985? Like I mentioned earlier, for more historical aspects of the band, that Born in the Basement documentary does a good job explaining all the record label chicanery that was going on that led to that disastrous turn of events. But early Overkill is really something special, and I'm talking not just the first album, but the EP that they put out right before that, even though it was recorded like years earlier. They never made any money off it. Those two releases combined constitute what I would consider the first era of Overkill, their first stylistic sequence. I actually kind of like the EP a little bit more. I think it has slightly better production than the full length, but both of them have this weird dark atmosphere. I would almost sort of call it blackened speed metal. Like, if this shit came out today, people would probably be comparing it favorably to something like Midnight. Back then, even though this is coming out like 84, 85, if it had been put out when it was supposed to be put out, it would work very much as a stylistic companion to the first Slayer album, Show No Mercy. Even at this early stage of their career, they're demonstrating what would become something of a trademark technique, starting off a signature song with a very emphatic riff played in isolation before jumping into the flow of the song proper and bringing that initial intro riff back in a more substantial form for the song's refrain. If we were talking about classical music, we'd probably call it an ostinato. Given that we're talking about 80s thrash metal, we just call it that thing that Overkill does at the beginning of the song.
I'm smart! Not like everybody says! Like dumb, I'm smart and I want respect!
Nice evil laugh leading into that flow of the song I was talking about. Bobby Blitz's vocals on this are kind of interesting. He's sort of like a much more evil version, more streetwise version of Bruce Dickinson from Iron Maiden around the same time period. And that mixes interestingly with the more punkish thrash metal staple of gang shouts. Also, he can make noises like this. into a very nice early 80s example of a thrash metal break, but this is where the song gets really interesting, because they do this weird thing where they almost start another song in the middle of the song proper, like this wacky little short black metal speed metal fusion. I'm thinking they got this idea of a really long complicated bridge that turns into its own song from Black Sabbath, but who knows? It might have just been their own wacky idea they came up with. But I'll tell you what isn't wacky is this monstrosity of an ascending the staircase thrash metal riff leading into a great melodic guitar solo. It's not quite the crazy level of shredding that Bobby Gustafsson would get up to in the latter half of the 80s, but it definitely gets the job done. But not only can he shred very effectively, he's also going to do some interesting stuff structurally with it in terms of how the solo interacts with the rest of the song. Right here. Doing a weird trade-off with the gang shouts and that riff from the intro of the song. See, I told you to come back.
By getting money added back.
Kind of filling in the gap with these little bursts of like mini solos. It's actually very similar to something Megadeth would end up doing 2 years after this album was finally released on Peace Cells. And in fact, when Chris Poland was ejected from Megadeth after the Peace Cells album,
Get out of here!
Dave Mustaine asked Bobby Gustafsson, guitarist Overkill at the time, to join Megadeth. Luckily for us, Bobby declined, so we got more Overkill albums with him doing solos on them. But that's way ahead in the future. Right now, we're still talking about early, weird black metal, speed metal, doom metal Overkill.
너는 산이야 바다야?
That's right. You might have noticed I mentioned Black Sabbath earlier. Well, the one song off of Overkill's self-titled EP that was not re-recorded for their first or second full-length albums was an honest-to-God 9-minute long super dark doom metal song entitled The Answer. And as that very Kirith Ungol-esque gong intro might have clued you in on, this isn't just any old doom metal, this is very epic doom metal. Minimalist, shamanistic type stuff, based heavily on epic lyrical narratives of gloom and doom. A lot of people just think of Bobby Blitz as being this very angry, kind of shouty, screamy kind of vocalist. I have to disagree. Dude's got range, as you're hearing right now. I also like that spooky gothic whispering that's overdubbed. This is such a cool song, and I don't think I've ever heard anybody talk about it, except maybe some crazy fanatic like Ultra Boris or something. This song's kind of a weird outlier for early Overkill's career, but this kind of stuff would become very important later on in the 80s for them. On the EP, it's just kind of a wacky oddity. Here they're more than earning that Iron Maiden font in the logo with some very Steve Harris sounding melodic bass playing from Dee Dee Verney, which takes us into a set of riffs that honestly wouldn't sound out of place on a Gates of Slumber album. And they're doing this shit 1983, 1984. Crazy ahead of its time, and speaking of crazy, crazy fucking vocal performance from Bobby Blitz. And it just gets heavier from there. I put this song up there with like Crypt Sermon or Candlemass in terms of just all out darkness and evil. And speaking of evil, this full stop right here.
And I'm the devil's son.
Magnificent song. Kind of wish that they had done another version of it on one of the first two full lengths just so more people would know about it. As it stands, like I mentioned earlier, it's sort of a weird oddity in the early Overkill catalog because they wouldn't really dabble that much in doom metal again until the end of the 80s. But once they finally get around to doing their first full length album in 1985, it's like the opposite of doom metal. This is a very hasty, desperate sounding album from a hasty, desperate band. I mean, they've been hanging on to this material since at least 1983, and they finally get to crank it out, and you get hit with one of the most monstrous speed metal numbers of all time that they still use to open a whole lot of their live sets almost every time I've seen them.
제가 V앱을 너무 안 한다고.
Okay, yeah, there's a little bit of doom metal left in the tank, but they mostly just use it for like intros and little segue parts. They don't do any more full doom metal songs for a while, because now we are going total speed metal Holocaust hell. Like, this might be the platonic form of the speed metal riff in this song. It's ultra primitive, and it has a nice little counterpoint bit right here. I can't get over how good their songwriting is, even on very simple songs like this one. Back into speed metal. If you got some kind of aversion to a band like Agent Steel because of the really falsetto ball squeezer vocals, Overkill might just be what the doctor ordered. Into another really cool bridge section. Important trademark of early Overkill composition. And of course some suitably black metal sounding lyrics about gravestones and moons and Satan and myth, ghosts. Early Overkill, spectacular. This first era of Overkill with the weird black and speed metal dark shit kind of ends right after their first album. Despite the fact that their second album also has a re-recording of a song from their 1984 self-titled EP, there's a pretty major stylistic overhaul. Not that that's a bad thing, because Taking Over is one of the best Overkill albums. The most famous song from it is probably Wrecking Crew, which they still play live nowadays a whole lot, and this one definitely shows up more of their snotty, very irreverent punk side. Which makes sense because punk's been a pretty important part of Overkill since the beginning, in addition to all of like the black metal, doom metal, thrash metal shit. I mean, they got names like Bobby Blitz, Rat Skates. Their bassist is literally named Dee Dee, and yes, that is a Ramones reference. So this Wrecking Crew song, it's punk done in the Overkill way. So that means that the riffs are going to be a little bit more technical than your standard sort of punk rock stuff, but the atmosphere is total punk. It's just that there's a whole fuckload of speed metal going on at the same time. Weird little bar chord thing Bobby's doing under the other Bobby's vocals here. That's interesting stuff. And speaking of that other Bobby, if you haven't noticed, his vocals have gotten even more bonkers on this album. Doing this really good job of switching in between screaming and singing in the middle of a stanza. The other real big famous song from this album is probably Deny the Cross, which is an amazing song, and it shows off my favorite new aspect of Overkill's sound as of this album, that being a very hefty dose of power metal, which was a genre still in its infancy at its time. But for my money, the best power metal song on this album isn't actually Deny the Cross. It's a song that I really haven't heard too many people talk about, but I did get to see them play it live once, and I was very excited to hear that, because this song is underrated as fuck, and is entitled Fear His Name. It has this absolutely majestic build-up in its beginning section with these layered melodic riffs, slowly increasing the intensity of the drums, building you up to what makes the song so gosh darn unique, something I haven't really heard done by too many other bands. And that is this bizarre blend of absolutely thuggish East Coast thrash metal with super melodic power metal. You got these like super heavy fucking pile driver riffs that have these melodic tails to them. In fact, the only other example I can think of this being done outside of Overkill would be the one Anthrax song that I really, really like, Medusa. You can put that on your fucking Jub trivia bingo card.
We lead the world in computerized data collection.
It's a uniquely East Coast style of power metal, thrash metal fusion. Not that I got anything against the West Coast style of power metal, thrash metal fusion. I mean, earlier on you heard me try to gerrymander Heathen and Metal Church into the Big Four. But these are like nuclear assault chug riffs that are also power metal riffs somehow. It's a miracle. Speaking of miracles, we still got plenty of those cool bridges that defined early Overkill sound, where it turns into like this whole new song that somehow gels perfectly with the rest of the song going on around it. There's some really cool interplay between the lead guitar and Bobby's vocals. Watch this little melodic fill bit here, kind of bouncing off of the vocal melody in an interesting manner. And some dank fucking Thin Lizzy style solos. He's doing trade-offs with himself. Is that masturbation?
You are hentai?
Well, whatever it's considered, I like it. And I also really like how they get into the main riff of the song at the end of the solo section here. This like collapsing section, bring in that sexy main riff, taking over. Not only one of the greatest thrash metal albums of all time, also one of the greatest power metal albums of all time. And not a lot of people know that. Jesus. We're almost like 14 minutes in. I feel like we only just started getting into Overkill. Apparently I have a whole lot to say about this band. Maybe not as much as I had to say about Gargoyle, but a lot. So yeah, no, this one's gonna be a two-parter. Next time, we're coming back to Overkill after a fairly major member shakeup. Original drummer Rat Skates leaves. Will this be the end of Overkill? I mean, probably fucking not, but you'll have to tune in next time to see. Anyways, Merry Christmas. Thanks for watching, listening, leaving comments and such. And I'll see you next time. Ho, ho, ho.
Open the fucking door. Open the fucking door!